So there's a couple of points. So for those who are new, I'm not going to start where I normally start, but the core principle will unfold, the core concept of this teaching. And so where I'd like to start is on a expansion of the core concept. Something that I see sometimes people getting stuck on. And it came up as one of the questions to a Facebook post today. And so it makes sense to go over it. So the core concept in the teaching is that the source of suffering in daily living is based, or is a belief, a deeply ingrained belief that life has put in place as part of the human's up-to-date conditioning. A belief that says, I am a separate, independent entity in complete control of everything that I think, feel, and do. So essentially that means we have the idea of ourself as the doer. And with this idea of myself as the doer, we see the other as the doer. And so the whole teaching is simply pointing at this dynamic, or this belief, which then creates a dynamic. So the belief is there, life is here, we find ourselves in a situation in life, and the situation, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, triggers this belief, because along with the belief I am the doer, there is the belief that my happiness is to be found in circumstance, my happiness is to be found in pleasure, in outcomes. And so with this deeply ingrained set of beliefs, I am the doer, therefore the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, we're forced to react when life unfolds in ways that are not in line with our preferences, meaning not pleasurable. So when life is painful, life is seen to be an attack on who I am based on this belief, based on this ingrained belief that my happiness, my completeness, is to be found in outcomes, essentially to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. And the flow of life, the nature of the flow of life, is really very simple. And if we come to see this for ourselves, and that's the point of all these concepts. So there's a lot of talking, they're all concepts, and the concepts are there not for us to just hear them and then repeat them and believe them, but they're concepts that can be seen for ourselves, verified, so that we see it and then we say, yeah, that makes sense. So then it's not just a belief. So if I say the flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain, and someone says, yeah, okay, the flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain, and for the rest of their life, when someone asks them, what's the flow of life? And the answer is, the flow of life is pleasure or pain. And they could repeat that 1,000 times. And then if someone says, what does that mean? And if someone hasn't seen it for themselves, like really understood what that means, then their understanding is limited. So if we really see the concept beyond an intellectual understanding, or even prior to an intellectual understanding, just a belief, then they start to work very deeply. So what inspired me to say that is that I put forward a concept. I've put forward about 20 concepts so far. And the concept I had just put forward is the flow of life. The nature of the flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain. Nothing more. Pleasure when the flow of life is in line with the biological preference of the body, which we didn't put in place. And pain when the flow of life is out of line with the biological preferences of the body, which we didn't put in place. It turns out that our unhappiness, when we look at it for ourselves, our unhappiness is not actually the flow of life itself. The flow of life is either pleasure or pain. And pain, no doubt, is painful. Pleasure, the nature of pleasure is pleasant. The flow of life, pleasure or pain, our unhappiness turns out to be our attitude, our relationship to the flow of life, our relationship to the pleasure or pain. that's the level where the suffering exists. So the flow of life, painful, yes. Circumstance, not what we would like, painful. The much heavier load of guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation, that exists on top of the painful situation based on our attitude to the flow of life. And that attitude is based on how we see ourselves, how we believe ourselves, what we believe ourselves to be. So this goes back to this deeply ingrained belief that I suggest is the core of all human suffering. It's not just one belief, it's a whole, well, it can be seen as one big belief, but it's got a whole lot of parts to it. And that belief is, I am the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, in pleasure. So actually that is what I normally speak about. The point that came up today was someone said in some of the teachings, it sounds like on the one hand you're saying there's no doer. And what that means, no doer, really means that whatever happens in life is a happening. It's part of the flow of life that we didn't create. And that doesn't just include what is external to the body, but it includes the movements of the body as well. And the movements of the body are not just the physical movements, but the thoughts and the emotions. Now, the movement of the body, the thoughts and the emotions, when we look at it for ourselves, are movements that we are convinced are my doing, my thinking, my actions, my results. And it's really that simple, is that when we look at life closely, without an investment in seeing it a certain way, it becomes clear that everything that's happening is mechanical. I don't necessarily mean wood and screws and metal mechanical. Biological movements are mechanical, it's biological mechanics. The laws of physics are mechanical. And if we look at it closely, the whole problem can unravel itself very quickly. At least start to unravel itself, because it starts with an intellectual understanding of what's being spoken about. And as that intellectual understanding is confirmed for oneself, based on one's own experience, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And as it goes deeper and deeper and deeper, it challenges the opposite beliefs that are in place that are very, very deep. So it does need to go deep, but it starts going deep as soon as we understand it intellectually. If we don't understand it intellectually, then the root doesn't get attacked particularly efficiently. So once again, what's being said is the belief in personal doership is a belief that actions that are completely mechanical, not even actions of what I am, are taken to be my actions, my movements, my thinking. And so if we see that the thinking, the emotions, the movement of the body is the movement of a biological instrument, then this deeply ingrained mistake, the root of human suffering, can fall away very quickly. And we don't need to understand the particular mechanics. We don't need to understand all of the physics laws. We don't need to understand how the biology works. We don't need to understand the genes and all of that. We just need to know the overall principle that, like when we know a car is a machine, I don't need to know how everything in the car works. I just know it's a machine. And now it's relegated to the realm of machine. So this is just another way of elaborating on something that we've all heard. You are not your emotions, you're not your thoughts, you're not your body. It's just really, if we start to see the relative as relative, if we start to see the mechanical as mechanical, the identification with what we're not starts to fall away. So the neti process is not this, not that. It's a variation of this same theme, until eventually, once we see everything we're not, all the things that we have identified with and felt dependent on, once that's all seen to be error, then that which we really are, which is sitting patiently in the background, presents itself more clearly. Connection is felt more obviously. And so we find that human happiness in practical terms, so not some concept about what enlightenment is, but in practical terms, human happiness turns out to be peace of mind in daily living, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. Meaning, circumstance, the flow of life, will continue to be pleasure sometimes and pain at others. So this realization, this liberation, doesn't suddenly make us immune to pain. It doesn't suddenly make us in control of the universe. It doesn't mean that everything works out as we wish. The flow of life continues to unfold, sometimes as we like and sometimes out of line with our preferences, and we find ourselves, without having to make effort, we find ourselves at peace. At peace only because it's our true nature, which is not being obscured by the suffering that used to happen automatically, had to happen when these deeply ingrained beliefs of who I am were in place. So the process is really a simple process. It's a process of the false ideas of who we are that life put in place dissolving. And it's life that put these beliefs in place, and it's life that dissolves them. Life has put them in place by delivering up-to-date conditioning, moment after moment after moment from the day we were born. And that up-to-date conditioning includes an aspect which we can call the thinking mind, and the root of the thinking mind are these beliefs that I've been speaking about. The belief I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And that's something that's there, something we haven't been in control of. We didn't choose which parents to be born to. We didn't choose which country we were born into, what the political situation was, what the religious views were, which school we went to, which friends we made, what events happened. And everything that happens moment after moment affects our up-to-date conditioning. And on top of that, the experience that we have is an experience of being the body, an experience of being in control. And so that experience, it's a feedback loop. That experience then becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning. And at some point in time, after life has done a great job of ingraining this strong belief, I am the doer, I am the body, and I'm in control of everything that happens, and my completeness is dependent on pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Effectively, the deepest pleasure that we're attached to is love. So really the deepest belief is that my happiness is dependent on love, love, love. Once life has done a great job at deeply ingraining that, at some point the tide turns and urges and thoughts start arising, which are not our doing, they just happen, like thoughts have always happened throughout our whole life. They start driving us in a direction of inquiring into the nature of life and trying to understand what this human condition is all about. Really, if we keep it simple, it's a search for the end of suffering. Intuitively, the suffering is driving us to ask these questions. The suffering is known intuitively not to be our true nature, and it drives us. So at a certain point in time, life then starts delivering new conditioning. that has the effect of either adding to our existing conditioning or radically changing the existing conditioning. And so make no mistake, these talks are simply life-delivering new conditioning. Anything that anyone has ever said on this topic of knowing thyself or happiness, however it's presented, is always conditioning. Anything that anyone ever says is a concept. Even if someone says, puts forward the concept to stop thinking, that's a concept that the intellect may or may not register. And at some point, it's the intellect that realizes it's my thinking of a certain type, which I believe to be beneficial, that's my suffering. And when the intellect realizes that, the intellect has been intelligently programmed. So we can call that the working mind versus the thinking mind. The working mind is the part of the up-to-date conditioning that includes our capacity, our language skills, our mathematics skills, our rational and logic skills, our communication skills, how to walk and drive a car. It's all part of the conditioning of the body. So conditioning in itself is not the problem. Conditioning in itself won't end. We'll always be conditioned entities on the biological level. The conditioning that's the problem is the conditioning in the thinking mind that creates this reaction to life on an attitudinal level, a reaction about who I am. So life unfolds, and it turns out that our suffering is our attitude to life, just like our happiness is an attitude to life. The attitude we have that creates suffering, which is not our doing, that attitude is an attitude that stems from these beliefs, an attitude of doership, an attachment to outcomes, and the attitude that ends up being in place, an attitude that allows peace to be there, is simply the absence of the previous attitude. So it's not a new belief system. We don't replace one set of beliefs with a new set of beliefs. We don't replace the belief, I am the doer, and my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 with the belief, I am not the doer, and my happiness is not to be found in pleasure. That happens for a period of time to undo the ingrained beliefs. That's how this process works. And then at some point, that will become new suffering. It'll be seen to not be freedom. It's a new belief system that has replaced the old one. But it becomes much more easily dropped when the understanding of the dynamic is in place. So really all these talks are talking to the intellect, to the mind. The mind has to get that the mind is the problem. It seems ironic, but it's how it works. We often hear, this is not at all about the mind. When the mind stops, it's not at all about the mind. When the mind stops, we find that our peace in ourself is something very different to the mind and to the mechanical, to the biological. And then it feels like the understanding is not at all intellectual. The understanding that we're talking about is a knowing, a being, direct knowing who I am. When I use the word knowing, not intellectual. I am it, so there's no question. The question, who am I, falls away when I am. And so the experience when mind stops is one where we know it's not intellectual. But the process by which mind comes to that halt is very much a process of the conditioning and the mind changing. So contemplating. We hear something and we contemplate it over and over, and it's the mind, it's the working mind that is chewing over the concept, and it starts off not really understanding what the concept is saying, and then it starts to get it and understand it intellectually, then it starts to observe it for itself in our own experience. We see what the concept is saying. For example, the concept that thinking is the problem, certain type of thinking, the question, what is my purpose in life? What is my mission in life? Seems like a very worthy question to have when we're looking for our mission in life. It turns out that that question is the problem. So there's a feeling of uncomfortableness with oneself, which when we look at it stems from this belief in personal doership, this idea that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, which creates a disconnection from what we truly are. And that presence of that belief system, the false idea of who we are, always manifests as an uncomfortableness with oneself. And then that uncomfortableness with oneself seeks an answer. And within the uncomfortableness, it suggests what the answer is. So sometimes we have this feeling that I just don't know my purpose in life, and it's an uncomfortable feeling. And then it says the answer to this feeling, the solution to this feeling, is to find out what your purpose is. But the uncomfortable feeling stems from an error, and the suggested solution to find out your purpose stems from that feeling. And then, but it feels very real. It feels like that's definitely the answer. Once I find out my purpose, my mission, when I find out what I'm meant to be doing here, then the uncomfortable feeling will go away. And so we keep asking ourselves, what's the purpose? What's my mission? What's the purpose? And that's actually, that's linked to the uncomfortableness, which stems from the idea my happiness is to be found in outcomes. When I'm doing something that's delivering great results, and everyone appreciates me, and I appreciate myself because I can't not appreciate myself once life is flowing perfectly and I'm producing good results, which is really, we can start to see it's this attachment to pleasure. Then with this idea, when I'm doing that, I'm going to feel satisfied. And inevitably, we find things that deliver us pleasure, and they never satisfy in the way that we imagine. They satisfy temporarily on the level of pleasure, but not deep down, providing a continuous unbroken peace or happiness. So when the mind realizes each time it asks the question, what's my purpose? I need to know what my purpose is. It's perpetuating the uncomfortableness. If it just stops asking that question, then the problem falls away. Sometimes it's hard. The problem falls away when we stop the question, and then it spins back into action again. But now I still need to know my purpose, and it starts again, that uncomfortableness. So if the working mind really registers that what seems like a perfectly worthwhile question to ask, logically it makes sense. I want to find my purpose, so I should ask what my purpose is. Only when the working mind realizes that even though it seems logical, it's the problem itself. The working mind at first might think, wow, stopping asking that question, how can that be the answer? How is that going to help me? And as the working mind starts to understand more and more, it cuts that thinking off. The thought might arise, your happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. That thought is part of our up-to-date conditioning if we've been exposed to certain concepts, for example. So the thought automatically, it's not our doing, it automatically arises when awareness and the working mind land on the thinking mind, obsessively thinking about what we need in the future. And once that's registered as suffering, the working mind thought kicks in. My happiness is not to be found in the flow of life, which cuts off the thinking of the thinking mind. And what's crucial is to understand that there's this field of being, which is where our true essence is to be found. A field of being that's outside of the thinking. If we don't know that there is a field of being, then what happens is the thought might arise, my happiness isn't to be found in this sort of thinking. But then we have nowhere to go, and the thinking just starts up again. And then the thought, my happiness isn't to be found in this thinking, and it cuts it off. But then we're still in that space of thinking, so the thinking starts up again. And if somehow life has brought about the experience or the knowing, the movement to a place that exists when thinking stops, where we find that I am prior to thinking, then when the thought automatically arises, your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. It creates a stop, and we can drop into that place of being and rest there. And the reason that that's so important is that being is self-contenting. So the obsession with happiness in the future is replaced with a self-contentedness in the present. And so eventually, when that obsessive thinking weakens enough, we can find ourselves resting in that self-contentedness for long enough for that to be satisfying. Whereas if we don't ever drop into self-contentedness, we cut off a suffering thought, but it's not replaced with anything substantial. There's still an emptiness there. So from that emptiness or uncomfortableness that always exists when we're not grounded in being, then what happens? The thinking carries on. So to know that there's this place which is our home, place of being, is really important as this other substitute. When the thinking stops, we have somewhere to rest. Here it is. And eventually, it's a movement that can take some time to, for the path between the head and the heart to be forged. But the more often that we drop into that place of being, the more that path is forged. And the answer isn't just to stay in that place of being, because if the root of suffering remains in place, what we find is we're continually dragged out of being. So to understand the dynamics intellectually of this root of suffering is really important, because what then starts to happen is a simultaneous action of investigation and contemplation along the lines of the pointers, which are specifically seeing for ourselves this dynamic in daily life that is being pointed at, a dynamic that's always been there but hasn't been seen in enough detail, hasn't been highlighted as the core problem. And so there's times when there's an investigation where we have aha moments about actually seeing the dynamic, and then other times which are these dropping into being, where no contemplation or thinking happens, and we confirm our true nature experientially. And the combination of knowing this formless self that is self-contenting and at peace, combined with contemplation that has that information that there is this space of being which is who I am, that exists and is complete in every moment, unaffected by the flow of life. That becomes a very powerful combination. And just using one of them only is not powerful. It takes much longer when if we just drop into being and there's no awareness of the dynamics, no awareness of the root of suffering, then what is required is a contemplation that will happen. We might not even realize it's happening, but it's still happening. Each time we come out of being, there's a contemplation, but it's a much less focused, a much less honed contemplation. It's sort of looking at all sorts of things, and it has to figure it out on its own over time. But if the concepts are very narrow and focused, then the contemplation becomes focused. And we see things happening quickly.
Hello. Can you? Hi. Um, I I understand now how it's important for the mind to actually get it, to get that certain concepts need to be dropped, or certain reactions or tendencies need to be dropped. Can people hear, or should I wait?
I can hear you. I'm worried that the room might not be here very soon. But that this happens. We seem to have a noisy venue. It's been happening.
Speaker, yeah.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, so while that has been definitely beneficial, and I can see how some of these concepts are easily dropped because of that understanding, there are a couple of reactions. So, okay, basically anger and anxiety. There's an understanding that it's totally not beneficial, and it removes me from I can't rest in being when anxiety arises, when anger arises. It's just, I've been noticing this in daily life, meaning that I get angry very quickly. Only when I never realized this before, but it's just becoming very apparent ever since I started meditating and inquiry, that in daily life I see these reactions happening more and more. And just a generalized anxiety, like there's a lot of fear. So it's just really hard. It's impossible to actually kind of drop those things. So I wonder, I'm whether I need to kind of understand the whatever story is behind, why I get angry, for example, why I'm constantly, actually there's a lot of fear, I guess, fear of death, which is there even in, just flying over here as well, it was just like the plane's going to crash. It's
Yeah.
It's anyway, if you can.
Yes. So, actually, your question allows me to talk to what I thought I was going to talk about at the beginning, and I didn't really. The concepts that are put forward are often mistaken as instructions of something to do. And when we look at what's being put forward, and most of the wording is specifically chosen so that it's not an instruction, but the doer inside of us, the principle that believes I am the doer and that I'm in control of life and that I need to make life look a certain way. Here's a concept that is not telling us to do anything. I'll never tell someone to do something because the deep understanding is there never has been anyone to do anything. And so the question arises, well, the core concepts of the teaching is that there is no doer, and yet you tell us to do all of these things. You tell us that happiness for the human being is the end of suffering. And the response to that is, well, actually, these are all descriptions of what's happening in life. They're never a prescription of something to do. But the doership principle inside of us hears it and straight away interprets it as an instruction, interprets it as something I have to achieve, I have to make happen. And if that happens, that's the belief in personal doership in action, as it is a lot of the time when it's there. And when I say this, when that happens, it's not personal, it's this dynamic. It's this belief that we didn't put in place, firing up in relation to the circumstance it finds itself in. So the circumstance is a definition or a description. Life or happiness for the human being is continuous unbroken peace of mind. And continuous unbroken peace of mind is the absence of suffering. Suffering is based on the belief, I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in the flow of life. And in practical terms, that suffering arises in the form of guilt, blame and pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So the ones you spoke about, worry and anxiety and blame. Now, all of that is a description of what's happening and where A leads to B leads to C. The doer hears it and says, oh, I have to make this happen. I have to make the end of suffering happen. And once again, if the working mind, this is what are the concepts? So what I've just put forward is a description, which is new conditioning that life is spitting out. I don't know what I'm going to say next. What I say next is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that I've never been in control of. Those two factors determine what I am on a biological level. No third factor. If I find a third factor, then this notion, this concept falls flat on its face. But when we look, time and time again, we don't find a third factor that affects what I am on a biological level. And so what comes out of my mouth is life delivering exactly what is destined to be delivered. New concepts, new conditioning that may or may not become part of your up-to-date conditioning. And if it does become a part of your up-to-date conditioning, it becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning, hopefully in the working mind. And the working mind says, these are not prescriptions of something for someone to do, but rather a description of something that might happen, or a description of life. So what it's saying is that the end of suffering might happen. And if the end of suffering happens, that's peace of mind. That's happiness for the human being. It's not saying do it, it's saying it might happen. And then it says how it might happen. It would happen if life brings about new conditioning such that it affects the old or the up-to-date conditioning in a way where the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes dissolves. And so this doership assumes, well, if that's going to dissolve, it's going to be by me doing it. What's being described is the mechanism by which life has always shaped the human being. Life delivers new conditioning, which becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning, and then the body functions automatically the way that it's designed based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so we need to look at this up-to-date conditioning, and we see that there's biological conditioning and psychological conditioning. The psychological conditioning is the thinking mind, and the biological conditioning is the genes and the working mind. And so in a particular moment when you find yourself blaming the other, so when you said getting angry, now technically anger is a biological reaction, and it's painful because it's not what we would prefer. Often we think anger is a psychological reaction. Anger is opposition to our peace of mind. The anger itself isn't. The anger is part of the flow of life, and it's just pleasure or pain. What happens when anger is there, which is pain, is the deeply ingrained beliefs of personal doership arise simultaneous to the anger and blame the other for delivering the pain. So the other does something that you don't like. That's pain in the moment. That pain in the moment creates anger, a biological reaction, which is more pain in the moment. And then our relationship to that pain, the two sets of pain, is a relationship of resistance. This pain is an attack on who I am. And you, the doer, who did this to me and delivered the pain, are completely responsible for attacking me, and therefore I hate you, meaning I blame you. And so the suffering is not the anger itself, but the blame that arises simultaneous with this. Now this is very hard to see because they arise simultaneously and they seem like one thing. It happened to be the last piece of the puzzle when I was listening to Ramesh. I just simply couldn't understand when he said anger is a biological reaction, anger is not suffering. Because my experience was whenever I got angry, I could feel this uncomfortableness with oneself, and uncomfortableness with oneself on a level of self, not on a level of pain, to me is, and to Ramesh, was suffering. the thing that disturbed our peace of mind. And biological reactions are not suffering. Biological reactions are just pleasure or pain in the moment. So when he'd say anger is a biological reaction, anger is not suffering, I'd go to my experience. I go, no, I can't sit with this. That was because I didn't realize that what was happening was that what I was calling anger was a combination of biological anger plus the suffering, plus the blame. So you look at the anxiety, you find yourself in a plane, that's the circumstance, and turbulence happens, something that you're not in control of, the circumstance. We're never in control of the circumstance. And then there is a reaction in the body, and the anxiety is a psychological reaction based on the thinking mind that is convinced that what we are is this entity, and that death is the final assault, the absolute assault on who I am. And so anxiety is linked to this belief that I am the body, and my happiness, my completeness is dependent on pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So death or physical injury is pain. And so this anxiety, if the ingrained belief is, if the psychological conditioning is a certain way, is forced to arise. So the anxiety is suffering. So with this, as we start to see this framework of concepts for ourselves in daily life, we'll see that suffering is a reaction that happens based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, the psychological conditioning, that I've never been in control of, which means the suffering is not something I'm in control of. So if we can see that when it happens, it's destined to happen based on the circumstance and my particular makeup, not my doing, it's an uncomfortableness with oneself, no doubt about that. But if we see ourselves judging ourselves, saying, you should be better than this, you shouldn't feel guilt, or you shouldn't feel anxiety. So that's guilt, saying I shouldn't feel anxiety. And that in itself is more suffering. When the working mind registers this, it says, so my resistance to suffering, which is a psychological reaction that I'm not in control of, my resistance to suffering is more suffering. So the concepts here are not telling us that we have to reject suffering. The description that happiness for the human being is the end of suffering is a description, not an objective that we need to set for ourselves. It's not something we can achieve. It will happen if it's destined to happen, and it will happen if it's destined to happen by life delivering certain conditioning that will dissolve the ingrained psychological beliefs that I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in the flow of life, and that too not my doing. So what does this result in? If the understanding goes deeper and deeper, what it results in is a witnessing life, a witnessing of the psychological reactions, a witnessing of the biological reactions, because the understanding is that these reactions are exactly that, reactions based on the body's biological makeup and psychological makeup that I've never been in control of. They're not my doing, they're not my thoughts, they're not my feelings, they're not my actions. And they will end when they're destined to end. The doer aspect can't let them be. The doer aspect judges them as appropriate or inappropriate and tries to get rid of them or hold on to things. And the more we see that movement is the suffering, the more the working mind understands, that's the suffering, there it is again. Then the thought automatically arises, whichever thought is relevant. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, or I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer, or that is suffering, which is a psychological reaction based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And these thoughts are not thoughts that you have to implement. They're thoughts that will happen spontaneously as a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. All of life, from the beginning of time to the end of time, all of life from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to sleep, is that a happening based on, we can say, the story of life or God's will, the story according to the creation? And if we want to look at it from the non-dual explanation, is that consciousness at rest, absolute nothing, prior to the manifestation, so the unmanifest, pure creative potentiality, explodes into manifestation. It becomes the manifestation, it becomes time and space. It has become this story of this universe. From the beginning of time to the end of time, everything that happens in the universe is the creation of Source. And the human beings are intrinsically one with that creation. The human being can't jump outside of the creation and exist independently. And if we start to see this, that all of life, the daily life experience, what the body does is completely predetermined according to the story of life, according to the creation, then the notion of doership no longer makes sense. So the doership can fall away if we have a profound realization that all of this is an arising in consciousness, a spontaneous arising in consciousness, unfolding exactly the way it's destined to unfold, spontaneously arising, collapsing in each moment, and the body and the human arises and collapses with the moment. So from that perspective, we can say everything is happening according to Source, or to God's will. God not being a separate entity somewhere out there looking in, God being that creative potentiality that explodes into manifestation, becomes the manifestation, becomes the perpetrator and the victim, becomes big and small, good and bad, health and disease, wealth and poverty. It's a story of duality, interconnected opposites, a story of time and space. And so nothing that happens in the manifestation is outside of the creation. So we can see it that way, or we can see that the creation has put in place genes and up-to-date conditioning. We don't even have to say the creation, but we go, I know I didn't do it. I didn't put in place my genes, and I didn't put in place my up-to-date conditioning. And so from that perspective, we can have a practical understanding of non-doership. And if we're lucky and both of them can coexist, we can see that both the explanation from genes and up-to-date conditioning and everything is happening according to Source are complementaries, that this story that is happening according to Source is a story of cause and effect, a story that's designed to appear like A leads to B leads to C, and therefore it's the story that has put in the genes and up-to-date conditioning in order for the next action to happen exactly as it happens. So when we see that everything is happening according to God's will, and that according to genes and up-to-date conditioning I'm destined to do what happens next, then once again it becomes, the paradox makes sense, and the misunderstanding that's part of the story falls away.
Roger, would you maybe from personal experience or for somebody else's experience explain? We had some discussion about moral principles or morality. Does this change after realization that we are not doers and everything is preconditioned, or it's, let's say, the same before and after the realization?
So the basic concept that I would put forward as an answer to that question is that this understanding won't make us perfect human beings. This understanding is not about changing the biological, this understanding is about recognizing that the biological is biological, that how the biological is based on one's genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the recognition that I have my good points and my bad points, and that I'm not a saint in the sense of being perfect. The attitude to the flow of life, meaning attitude to the pleasure and pain, really means an attitude to my good points and my bad points that is uninvolved with the outcomes. It sees that the outcomes and the movement of the body is not my doing. I really am not in control of it. To the extent that we want to keep insisting we're in control is because we want to somehow insist that we can control outcomes such that we make them more pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Especially if I act morally, then my moral actions will be appreciated by the others and I will be loved. And that stems back to the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure. Essentially, my happiness is to be found in the love of the other. So when we recognize that we're continually trying to control the human behavior, then it might click that, oh, I'm doing this because of my attachment to outcomes. So once again, in brief or in a basic form, we would say this understanding doesn't change the biology. It changes our attitude to the biology. It means that we end up with an attitude of non-attachment. An attitude of non-involvement means not judging what happens through this body or through the other bodies as out of line with the flow of life. So it's seen that whatever happens through this body is destined to happen. Whatever happens through the other body is destined to happen. And the attitude doesn't resist what is happening. On a biological level, there will still be a resistance to those things that are painful. So if the water pipe bursts in the living room, let's say, and the living room starts being flooded, biologically we're not going to sit there and say, well, this is destiny. Attitudinally, when we see the pipe burst, we'll say, we won't say this is destiny, but the opposite reaction won't happen if the understanding is deep. It will be accepted as destiny, but then a movement to try and fix the pipe will happen. We either use our own skills or we call a plumber. And if we use our own skills, the outcome's not in our control. We might think we've fixed it and then it bursts overnight. Or we call a plumber. He says he'll be there in an hour and he is there in an hour, or he's not there 5 hours later. So biologically, we still need to act according to the circumstance. But psychologically, on an attitudinal level, we accept everything that happens. So if someone pushes me, that's pain in the moment. I might biologically push back, but attitudinally there's an acceptance that this is destiny unfolding, my destiny for there to be pain in the moment by being pushed, my destiny to push back, their destiny to push harder, who knows where it goes. When it's over, there is an acceptance that that was all unfolding exactly as it was destined to unfold. I wasn't the doer, the other wasn't the doer, so there's no blame towards the other and no guilt towards oneself. I might find myself in hospital, I might find myself in prison. Those are consequences of the biological unfolding, part of destiny. And even if I find myself in prison, the thought might arise, well, I shouldn't have hit back. But there won't be guilt that says, I was the doer, I am guilty, I am inadequate as a human being because of what happened. That aspect will be absent. So, the basic is that this understanding doesn't change the biological aspects. What we then find is that when the psychological aspects change, when the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes change, at first there are still a lot of vasanas in the system, the old tendencies and habits still remain in the system, and we might see the body playing those vasanas out. And with this understanding, it'll be seen as the body's karma playing out and non-involvement in the body's karma. But as the understanding goes deeper and deeper and uproots this belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes more and more, which in historic or traditional terms is the ego, as that gets dissolved more and more, what we find is that the movement towards greed, the movement towards stealing, the movement towards intentionally hurting another no longer makes sense. And when these deeply ingrained beliefs uproot completely, we find that there is a natural morality, a natural virtue that happens, which is not at all my doing. There's no intention to be virtuous or moral. And when it happens, we just see that the opposite of it doesn't make sense to the biology anymore. It simply doesn't make sense to be greedy, let's say, or to steal, or to seek revenge over the other, or to argue and be right. And so then we find that the virtues that are spoken about tend to be virtues of our true nature, functioning on all levels. They're not virtue. True virtue is not because we set up a set of shoulds and shouldn'ts of how I should act. That would become part of the attachment to outcomes. So it's very important to take the stance that the understanding, which is peace, is not to do with becoming virtuous or having particular biological behavior. It's about our attitude to that. But the process does tend to change the movement of the body as well. And that's a bonus. It's not our peace. It's not the peace is the attitude to what's happening.
I'm not sure if I heard all you said because of the machine outside, but if I understood you on the physical level or biological level or on the phenomenal level, probably nothing will change, but will change our attitude. We will not suffer.
That's right. And then that change of attitude, as it goes deeper and deeper, can change some aspects of the biological movement. But certain aspects of the biological movement have got nothing to do with this psychological aspect. So our personality will remain more or less the same. Our preferences that are genetic preferences will remain more or less the same. So what we'll find is that on a behavioral level will remain more or less the same. Those behaviors that were happening before that were linked to the psychological aspect will fall away. But to set an objective of becoming a perfect human being is coming from the belief in personal doership that is attached to the idea that my happiness is actually dependent on pleasure, 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 pleasure. My happiness is dependent on me being perfect so the rest of the world loves me, so that I can love myself.
Okay, may I give an example? For example, if I used to cheat my business partners before the realization, I will cheat them after realization, but I will just not suffer.
The basic realization, in theory, you'd say the basic realization, yes, that's right. You'll find biologically you are forced to continue cheating, and now you won't feel guilty about the cheating. But as the understanding goes deeper and deeper, you might find that the cheating is based on an attachment to outcomes, and that too can fall away. If we set this attitude of looking at what you're talking, this is why I'm answering it on a basic principle. We have to assume that actually the freedom is a freedom of our attitude to what is happening. Freedom of an attitude towards suffering, as of cheating, as not my doing. Now, this is very different to taking it on as an intellectual belief. So the belief in personal doership that has certain habits could hear this and say, well, this is great news. This is excellent. I'm not the doer, and so I don't need to feel guilty about my cheating. If the doer hears this as an intellectual concept, it can become a justification. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't deliver peace of mind to that doer that is using it as a justification. It might be a justification for a while to continue cheating, but then the ingrained guilt will still be there. And so at some point the doer will realize, I've just taken this on as a belief, because what I'm really looking for actually is peace of mind. And if the understanding is not intellectual and it really sees that whatever is happening on a biological level is truly a result of not me, then even when the cheating happens, if it's true seeing, there really won't be any guilt, which is peace of mind. And if someone's hearing this and the sense of personal doership is active, and the sense of personal doership wants pleasure, 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 it says this is terrible because everyone's just going to do whatever they want, which really means pain to the person that wants pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. But the fact is, that's how life unfolds. That's how life has always unfolded. And because we have this idea of personal doership that makes us feel a little better on one level, thinking that people are not going to act irresponsibly, on another level we find it creates our uncomfortableness, and more importantly we find that belief doesn't prevent people from acting irresponsibly. This is, once again, it's a description of what has always been happening. There's never been a doer. Life has always been unfolding based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so coming to see that this is the case creates a liberation, and it tends not to create more irresponsibility. The reason it doesn't create more irresponsibility is because the entity that in the past has been greedy and wanting more, believing it's its pleasure, has now dissolved. And so the irony is that when I drop my shoulds and shouldn'ts, when I drop all of the ideas of how I should act responsibly, the mind will imagine that's going to create a very chaotic human being, a very irresponsible human being. And in practice it does the very opposite, because certain dynamics fall away. So another aspect that I wanted to speak about at the beginning is when we say, so I had a conversation today with Jen, as we look deeper and deeper, sometimes, so this is picking up on pedantics in a way of language. So the conversation was, for example, we might say, I find myself getting very attached to circumstance. And so I asked, so this is an explanation of, sometimes it drives people crazy when we hear this, who is attached, right? And so I'm not using this, I'm not just saying who is attached as a throw out non-dual line. I want to explain it. I want to say, what does it really mean? This statement, this question, who is hungry? Who is thinking? Who is attached? Because we hear it sometimes and we go, well, either we know that there's no one there, or we don't, and we go, well, I'm attached. That's what I said. I find myself getting attached, or I am very attached to circumstance. So then I ask, who is attached? Now, why do I ask who is attached? Because, and so now let me add another statement to add to the explanation. If we say, I am pondering what to do next, or I am contemplating some of these concepts. I could ask, who is pondering these concepts? Who is pondering what to do next? Who is attached? And what that question is pointing at the fact that when we really look at it, as we've been pointing at, the body is a biological entity, genes and up-to-date conditioning, and thinking is a product of the brain, part of the body, part of the biological entity. The brain is a very complex, beautiful machine. And what it does is it produces thoughts. Thoughts based on the circumstance we find ourselves in. Something is seen, heard, tasted, smelt, touched. Something that we're not in control of seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, or touching. And as a result of the circumstance we weren't in control of, a thought arises. And no one is in control of what the next thought is going to be. The thought arises as a result of what is seen, smelt, tasted, heard, or touched. And so this thinking that we say, I am thinking, I am pondering, when we really look at the mechanics, we don't find anyone there. Who is this I that is thinking? What it's pointing at is thinking is happening, pondering is happening, hunger is happening. Who is hungry? The I, when we say I am hungry, is believed to be this entity, this doer that creates the thoughts, creates the hunger. And when we say it, I am hungry, what we find is that the doer is contained in that I. So I am hungry is a thought. The feeling I am hungry is a feeling. Still, we didn't create it. There is just hunger. Who is hungry? The biological instrument is creating a feeling of hunger. Who thinks? The biological instrument is thinking. There is no thinker of a thought other than the machine, the brain. Then the brain produces a thought, I am hungry, I am thinking. And in that thought, the I, as a fictitious entity, comes into existence. And so this isn't to say that we will stop using personal pronouns in life. When all of this is understood, we come back and live our life as this human being, interacting as if I'm the doer, as if I'm the body, interhuman relationship, which means when someone tells you, where did you go yesterday? We don't say, oh, I don't know what you mean. There's only the now. I don't know what yesterday is. We function as if there was a past and as if there will be a future, as if cause and effect are real. And in the same way, as if I am this, but with the deep understanding that what this is actually a biological entity, and this is the important part, into which impersonal consciousness of Source has linked, and the combination of impersonal consciousness of Source and the biological entity. So for the last hour and a bit, really have been talking about the functioning of the biological entity based on two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning. The third factor that makes up the human being is the subject, the impersonal consciousness of Source that links to the particular instrument and functions through it as personal consciousness, having a personal consciousness experience, meaning the experience from the perspective of this body, creating the experience that feels like I am the body and I am in control. And that experience doesn't change. What changes is the beliefs that say I am the body, because the experience says I'm the body, so the beliefs then are I am the body, I am in control, my happiness is to be found in pleasure. The beliefs fall away. The experience remains of being the body, the human, but now without those deeply ingrained beliefs, which then means I still say I am pondering, with the understanding that pondering is happening, not my doing. And that as a result of that pondering, another action is going to happen, a decision, let's say, to buy a ticket or not to buy a ticket. And that action is going to have an outcome, positive or negative, and that outcome is not in my control. So if I can see that from the very beginning what's happening is a biological reaction, and there is no me, no doer here doing it, see, that is the peace, that's the pleasure of the absence of pain. Of course, the peace of mind was always there, because the attitude to the pain was, this is life as it's destined to be in this moment, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, and my completeness is not dependent on life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. However, we can't deny that when the pain ends, there is a significant difference on the level of pleasure and pain. So, I'm not sure where I was.
Boundary.
Oh yes, I didn't hear what you said, but you reminded me anyway. Thinking. So, yeah. So everything is just happening, and then when I say I am thinking, with the clear seeing, we realize there really is no thinker. It's just happening. But if we say it, we can have an understanding about non-doership on some level, like it's sunk in to some level, but then we still say, oh, I find myself getting caught up in circumstance, for example. And then we look at it and go, who's getting caught up in circumstance? And then we realize that getting caught up in circumstance is just a certain thinking, the attachment to the circumstance that says, you know, my pleasure that was there has gone away. Someone has taken it away. And I blame them for taking it away, and it shouldn't be taken away. And so that is what we call attachment. And we say, I am attached. And then the question is, who is attached? Because when we look at it, we find that attachment is just thinking. And who thinks? The brain thinks. What is the brain? It's a biological instrument based on genes and up-to-date conditioning. So to the extent that we see more and more that all of these things are just happening, then there's this witnessing of the flow of life. And the witnessing, when it becomes deeply, deeply ingrained, means that it falls away from being a palpable sense of witnessing. We come back to the body just moving exactly as it's destined to move, doing in each moment exactly what it thinks or feels it should do, all based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. And what we find is there is no guilt or blame or pride, no expectation in the future, no worry or anxiety. And then we can conclude witnessing is happening. I can't feel witnessing is happening. I come back and feel like I am this. But when we see that the suffering isn't arising, we don't say, oh, the witnessing has stopped because I can't feel it. We say the witnessing is still happening in the background, obviously, and witnessing is simply the absence of the involvement that comes from the deeply ingrained beliefs, I am the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So witnessing doesn't have to take a palpable form. It doesn't have to be in a form of open, formless awareness. It starts off as that in order for certain aspects of consciousness, the awareness aspect, for example, of consciousness, to become recognized, so we can understand that the essence of the human being is not the biological, so it becomes experiential, that wow, what I am is this formless awareness, not the biological. And that sets in for a period of time, and at some point it's destined for it to become much more centralized, the experience to come back much more centralized in the body, which we sometimes think well, this was the discussion we had yesterday with Martin. Sometimes we might think, oh, I'm regressing back because the state has changed. But if we really look at it and realize, actually, I come back to a more centralized view, but the reactions of guilt and blame and pride don't happen even when life is painful. And when we ask that question, what am I really looking for in practical terms? The answer is, I'm not looking for a oneness experience. I thought I was looking for a oneness experience, but that's when I might have got lost in a concept. In practical terms, what I'm looking for is the end of suffering, which turns out to be happiness for the human being. And whether that end of suffering is there with a oneness experience or without a oneness experience, with witnessing in a palpable sense or in a non-palpable sense, who cares? All I'm looking for in practical terms is the end of suffering. I'm not looking for the end of being human or the dissolving of the person. We might think we are, because we might think that suffering requires suffering comes from the personal experience, and so we assume that suffering is the end of the person. Suffering is the end of the sufferer, not the end of the person, and the sufferer is the belief in personal doership. The person is something very different. It's still personal, and it doesn't create suffering when the belief in personal doership has fallen away. So really, once we're clear, I'm looking for happiness for Roger in this life. Happiness for Roger in this life is simply the end of suffering, and I truly don't care whether it's available in a oneness experience or in this human experience. In fact, from my own personal experience, I much prefer it in the centralized human experience form, because we get to have interhuman relationships. We get to live as if I am this, knowing deep down that the essence of this is that the essence of the human is formless consciousness, that when the body dies, the consciousness that inhabits the body isn't affected, and so the fear of death then falls away. And when the fear of death falls away, the fear of pain in the moment on a psychological level falls away. The biological resistance to pain in the moment will still be there. So turns out that witnessing is not necessarily just a palpable state of open awareness. Witnessing turns out to be the unfolding of life, moment after moment after moment, pain sometimes, the absence of the attitude of suffering. So witnessing turns out to simply be the absence of suffering, meaning the opposite of witnessing is involvement. So involvement is the identification and attachment to circumstance, and witnessing is the absence of that involvement.
So the word spoken triggers some pondering.
Say that
The
again.
words spoken trigger some pondering.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes like this. You say something like attached pleasure comes out of this idea of outcomes of life, how it unfolds.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I picked up on something you spoke, knowing truthfully who you are, and then somehow living this through your human experience. If someone asks you, how was yesterday? You just respond, well, I had a very nice day and happy, and this happened, that happened. Knowing fully that's a story, but you just respond this way. But that sounded, it came into me like that's a truth. But then I remember seeing also examples of maybe that doesn't necessarily have to be the up-to-date conditioning, if you so to speak. So I remember like Muji saying, someone like, who are you? Like, I'm the self. Then what's your favorite color? It's the self. Like, speak this way. So I felt he was giving example of being fully able to express truth always. And this comes up just now, but like, isn't it like maybe also still this attachment of outcome that we maybe prefer, and this is not a choice, but prefer to go back to the conditioning which gives the idea of this personal experience. And also today, I remember a thought coming like, if someone would ask me, who are you? Then I could also respond like, well, there's no who.
Mm-hmm.
So that would leave the words, are you? And my response would be, yes, I am.
Yeah, I agree. But
So, you know?
so on the same, so this is the thing, is like, we're not saying, when I say, someone says, how was your day yesterday? When I answer, it was very nice, I'm not pretending my experience is with a memory of yesterday. So the memory is here, and we live life as if there was a yesterday and as if there is a future. So even when someone is saying that I live completely in the present moment, I don't believe in the past or the future, right? They're not truthful. It's a concept, right? It's a very useful concept. The fact is that they then get up to go from here to there. They go to they have an urge to eat something, so they go to the fridge, which is over there. So they are still functioning as if there is a here and a there, as if there is time and space. So they move through time and space to get to the fridge. And similarly, if someone says, what are you going to do tomorrow? That person who might say, time absolutely doesn't exist, will answer...
You wouldn't have to go into these truths, you could just say, I don't know.
Yeah, but I'll just make the point, is that we could also say, well, tomorrow I have plans to go to the beach.
Also,
So,
yeah.
so that's not untrue. So I completely agree with what you said, is that if someone asks me, who am I, right? One of the spontaneous answers that comes up sometimes in particular situations, quite limited, right, is I am, because it's true, right? Or how are you? Not maybe who are you, how are you? And I say I am. It to me is a very nice answer to that question. And at the same time, if someone says, who are you? I could say I'm Roger. Because simultaneously, I really am Roger in experience. I'm not consciousness, except as the essence of Roger. So I could say, who are you? I could say, in essence, I am consciousness. And that would be true. And if someone says, who are you? I could say, I am Roger. And that would be true also. So to come to see that life is a paradox, which means that depending on which way we see it, we can answer a certain way, and that they're not contradictions, but complementaries, then we have the freedom to answer it however we like. And so if someone were to come and have a discussion with me about the essence of, or I am formless awareness consciousness, I can engage in that discussion because I understand, okay, we're having that discussion on that level. And then if someone else comes and says, yeah, but actually in practice I am a combination of consciousness and the body. I don't the experience is not of one only. The experience is of both. And so then we can have a conversation about being, Roger and Martin.
The reason why I'm sharing is just like this feeling that using memory also, that when maybe brought up as a child or something, going to school or wherever, and the language would be like, how do you feel? Yeah, well, I feel like, and then there's also this identification with that. Well, if the language would be changed to more what's really happening, so, well, this feeling arises within me, and I could name it this or that, but then it already has this distance in it, in the language. Mm-hmm. So something inside feels like changing the language more and more, even so if the outcomes first wouldn't really be satisfying in a way, because the responses can still be like, oh, well, while others may, well, oh, wow, what's he talking about? Or How does he come to that?
So,
So-
I think, if our belief of the past and our belief of the future is that it's absolute, it tends to cover up the present. And so if we're completely identified with the past and the future and what we need, we tend to live from up here. And so if someone says, how do you feel? You go to your head to answer the question. That's where we think the answer is, how do I feel? Yeah, it's a good day. And no, how do you feel? And someone will say, I just told you how I felt. No, and you can see that they haven't touched in here for a long time. And so when that keeps us up there, at some point we rebel against this attachment to the past and the future, and we go, no, I don't believe it exists, because we see what trouble it causes. In a sense, it keeps us disconnected from a lot of things that are right here, where past and future don't exist in the timeless present, right? So there's a bit of a rebellion against certain old ways of relating to, which is why we hear people talking in the passive tense, like eating is happening, and saying, I don't know what you mean about yesterday, all I know is now. Because it's that deepening of the process for that person, where they are the belief that there is these things as real, these other things, is falling away. But then the integration is where they come back and we go, I don't need to talk like I'm third person all the time, and that there is no time and space. Because now they come back and we remain connected. So now there isn't that issue where in the past, if I refer to anything, even if I think, if I think, I get disconnected. So we have to not think, because as soon as I think, I get disconnected, because we have a certain attitude to thinking. And so for a while we have to break that attitude, and all sorts of things, renunciation practices, sitting in being, meditating, not thinking, they're very useful to break a certain relationship. But then something comes in and says, this isn't quite right either. And my experience is it's great where we go, I can say about the past and the future now, and it doesn't create this obstacle to being. So then we get to live with attention outwardly and inwardly at the same time. That when that happens, it's great, because for a long time we find our attention is either outward and there's a disconnection, or we go inward and nothing outward. We can't really interact.
Maybe it's also battery low.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see what we can do about that.
Thank you. So maybe this then also up-to-date conditioning or out of date. So, but it's maybe have to do with the worldview. So like the worldview of maybe wondering very many enlightened beings already, maybe all of them, and those who are not, and those who are still using like the personal language like we spoke in our examples, and those who are still suffering. But also, I feel also because this language comes in this way, it makes it easier to identify, I feel this way. Mm-hmm. So then this idea comes that if the language would be like straightened for everyone, then also for the ones who are still identified, it would be easier to see this.
You're very right. The changing of language changes. Often our language reflects our beliefs, and that's why the language changes from using personal pronouns to impersonal. To me it's a very good sign when that happens, because now there's an incongruency. We say, I can't say, we can't say a lot of things because we don't believe it anymore. We don't see it as truth. And so there's a aligning, and then we go back, thankfully, where because it wouldn't be very nice if the whole world was speaking like that. It might be very useful.
Is that an idea or a truth? I wonder.
Yeah, for myself, it was a great relief to be able to just settle back into, oh, I am this, actually, because, and so you might have heard when I went to Ramesh the first time, I went with, one of the first conversations we had was from the non-dual perspective, because that's the only place I wanted to have a conversation from. And then he asked me, so who is speaking to whom? And my response is, well, you could say consciousness is speaking with consciousness, and consciousness is listening to consciousness. And this was his response just epitomizes what that part of the process was for me. It started with this discussion, and it was, Roger, don't be ridiculous. Roger is speaking with Ramesh, and Ramesh is listening. Ramesh is speaking with Roger, and Roger is listening. And as I had mentioned, I think the story yesterday, it had taken me 4 years of being immersed in the non-dual teachings to actually see that there is no Roger, there is no Ramesh, everything is consciousness. And so my language was all about from that perspective. And I find myself exactly where I needed to be at that point. And Ramesh's job was to say, okay, come back down from up there to down here. And when I realized that that was the next part of the movement, only because the first part had done what it needed to do, the peak experiences stopped happening, the various states stopped happening, which, had you told me this was going to happen, several months before, I would have thought this is very bad news. I don't want the peak experiences to stop, the states to stop. That's enlightenment. That's what's happening. The person is dissolving, and I'm becoming the impersonal. And Ramesh said, come back down, come and live as this. That's what this life is about. And so in certain contexts, yes, of course, I am consciousness, you are consciousness. But when practically speaking, I am Roger and you are Martin. But only at the right time. This is not saying, none of these are truths, they're concepts. Actually, we just are without any labels. So we drop all labels and we live, and then go to the experience and see what you are. And even that maybe is labeling it, but what we'll find, I think, is well, yes, when I just drop all labels, I feel like I'm Roger walking through the world with the deep understanding from experience as well, realization that actually the whole world is arising inside what I am as formless consciousness. So it's, we hold one, but the other doesn't get dissolved because we hold one standpoint, because we're not really holding that as the exclusive standpoint. So I think what you're saying is spot on, and I'm not really I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm saying that it's both.
Thank you for the exchange.
Yeah. Yes. Oh yeah, you can tell me how you went with not having a job. Yeah, but after, yeah.
Is it okay?
Yes.
I also really like this outlook towards the awakening, that all I wanted from the seeking was the absence of suffering, and happiness is merely living, and the peace of mind gives me both of that. But there is also another movement which is obvious and which cannot be denied, is that like when there is when the identity experience of I am is kind of constricted mostly to the body. This is one state, and the other state in which in this state in which it feels as if there is a constriction in my experience, and the sensations in the body, the emotions, feelings, thoughts, all of these seems very intimate, and in a way it kind of creates some disturbance in my peace. And when this experience transforms into what I call as no self, in which there is an experience of emptiness, and in that none of these appearances seems intimate. It seems they don't have weight. And I also would like to live as just you described, as a human, at a human level, but this natural movement seems to be happening, which like I can't stop it. So when there is constriction, it is so heavy that it becomes unbearable. So this movement towards oneness, it seems as if a natural evolution, natural transformation.
It is. It shows us what the essence of the human is. It points to the formless nature that we are, that is unaffected by the flow of life. It shows us that when this identification is not present, there is peace. When we find ourselves going into the humanness and finding suffering there, and then we go into the more open view and find peace there, then we conclude that being human is suffering and being formless awareness is peace. And what the suggestion here is that being human is not suffering, but rather being human with certain beliefs in place is being human and suffering. And so when the beliefs fall away, we can find that being human is not suffering, and so therefore being oneness isn't necessary. But this is not, let's be very clear, this is not saying that oneness experiences and resting in being where thinking isn't happening. It's not saying that there's anything wrong with it. It is, that's why I started off, it is a natural evolution. But in my experience, there was a great liberation in the phase moving from, as a continuation of the evolution, moving from the oneness back into being human where there was no suffering. And the question is that happens when the beliefs that are in place, so when we come back into being human, the beliefs that were there before the oneness experience, or before going into the more open view, the beliefs that were there before are there afterwards. And so when we come back, we feel like suffering again, so we want to go back to this. And maybe the answer is that those beliefs that create suffering need to be dissolved by life, and then we won't feel like we need to go back there, because we go back to being human and the beliefs aren't there anymore.
How is it only a belief? Like it is felt at an experiential level that the objects starts appearing as tangible again, and when you are in this spaciousness, then it feels like there is very less tangibility in the phenomenal objects, like the body is not tangible.
Sure, because in that state, you're viewing life from the perspective of awareness as the subject, being the container in which everything arises. And the container is formless awareness. And so then it becomes clear, oh, well, the phenomena is actually in essence formless awareness. It's an illusion. We can look at things freshly. If you look at a wall, when we look at it with the old beliefs, we look at the wall as a solid entity because we've always touched the wall and it's solid. And when you look at it from the perspective of formless awareness, it's an image. It's like everything else in the arising. It's made of what it arises in. It's all intrinsically the one substance that permeates through everything. And it's that one substance, that awareness that it's made of and witnesses it. And this is very profound realizations presenting themselves experientially. And maybe the process carries on. This is one of the hallmarks of spiritual seeking, is that when a shift happens, we go, oh, this is it. And we've said that many times before, this is it. And then in hindsight, we see it changes, it progresses. And so this is it belief, the this is it belief can sometimes become a hindrance at some point. But we don't need to worry. So, if we talk too much about it, it sounds like it shouldn't be that and it should be this. And at the end of the day, the great relief is we're not doing any of this. The process is a process that, when we look at it, is not my doing, it's all happening. The insights happen, the contemplation happen. I find myself in certain places, reading certain books, meeting certain people, having certain events happen. The whole process is part of this magical exploration or magical expression of life. And at some point we can relax and say, this is how it is, this is how it was, it will be a certain way, and I can rest and trust, based on my own experience, that everything is taken care of, and enjoy the profound experiences, the profound states when they present themselves, not resist them, not think that we have to move past them, always just recognizing if maybe there is a belief in place. Because the process is ultimately a process of transcending beliefs, recognizing a belief because they have a very good habit of being elusive and sabotage or camouflaged, and the belief being transcended is always it popping out of its camouflage, and we go, wow, I didn't realize I believed that, and then it gets transcended. So
actually my intention is exactly in every moment the way you described that it should be, but it feels as if when this clear seeing gets obstructed by any whatever reason, I don't know, and it seems falling back into the form again, then the density is so much that it creates a longing to become nothing again.
And the mind, the working mind, can at some point pick up that longing in itself has become a form of suffering.
Yes, it becomes.
So to see that when a shift happens back into a suffering presence of suffering, to realize, okay, this is valid. To set the other up as an expectation is exactly, one of the forms of suffering. Expectation of life being a certain way. So when we become aware that my insistence that life is always peace is in itself the root of some suffering. And the mind says, well, if I accept that, then I'm just going to be left with suffering. The thing is, if you accept that, you're going to be left with less suffering. And if you accept that, the root of the suffering has been seen. So the very acceptance of the suffering means that the root of suffering has become less, which is why we find that in this story of life, those things that seem logical, those things that feel intuitive, when it comes to this exploration of self, which lies outside of the logical realm, those things that seem logical are actually not helpful sometimes. And that the counterintuitive is what solves the problem. So what I mean is the idea that I want to return back to oneness seems like a logical and helpful intention. At some point we realize actually that is suffering. And so the counterintuitive is to allow the suffering to be there, meaning to not resist it.
The intensity of form gets so much intense that like it becomes unbearably painful to remain as something for a long period of time. So I have to find some satsang or some place where I can again go back into the untangible.
Yeah.
Beingness.
So if it's unbearable, then that's more suffering until it changes. However it changes, you find satsang, or there is a allowing. So what you're describing is a description of what's happening, which is not invalid in life. Life is that experience. And so life is the experience with all its colors. To the extent that we realize I am not the doer, and that life is the experience that I can't do anything about, then there is a allowing. Biologically, the movement might be to go and take a Panadol or find a satsang. And then it's seen that that movement is part of the inevitable movement of life as well.
So if I understood correctly, and if I put it in a practical terms, then suppose I again go back to my normal day-to-day life and I start the job, and in the job I find myself again getting in a constricted state of being. So there wouldn't be that trying to escape the job and go to satsang so that I can escape this constriction and fall back into the...
So if you set that intention, you might find yourself attached to being in the job, because you've set the idea that moving away from the job is attachment to pleasure. And then you might set up attachment to staying in a particular situation. So it's about dropping either of moving or and then living from the perspective, I understand that all of life is a happening, unfolding exactly as it's destined to happen, and in practical terms that means doing in each moment exactly what you think or feel to do. Knowing that what you think or feel to do is part of your biological makeup at the moment, your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which will include maybe some psychological, some biological, and you move from there, which is what's destined to happen. And if suffering arises, it means that there was a movement from the psychological. To the extent it's witnessed and understood and not and there's no involvement in that suffering, then the psychological will diminish further. So there isn't a way to do it. There is a realization that in each moment something happens, and I don't know what that's going to be. And there isn't a right or a wrong way, there is the way. The way based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, or the way according to the destined story of life. Whatever is going to happen next, happens next. The outcome not in your control. And if awareness of that happens, also not in your control. And yet, even though it's not in our control, what we find is that life has this. Life has taken us this far. No reason to be pessimistic that it's going to dump you now. That's what Ramesh used to say. You find yourself sitting in satsang, not your doing, not my doing. You find that life is delivering this new conditioning, which is conditioning that is a complete attack on the belief in personal doership. So we recognize that and we go, actually, it's all under control. Can relax. At some point you can say, well, I might as well go to the beach, actually. When we really see that the freedom and the deep understanding is that there's nothing to do. So if you, from deep understanding, say, why am I, going around in, from satsang to satsang, maybe.
Well, that is valid only when you're already there, you are already free. Then you feel that there is nothing to do.
Yeah, or very close to, That's what I mean. If you have that realization, actually, there's nothing to do. I might as well be at the beach. Then going to the beach with that realization is a very deep understanding, which means you're going to be at the beach with freedom. Or maybe not. There might be suffering, but with that understanding, the suffering is going to be witnessed.
In this moment, I could say that there is nothing to do and I could run away to beach. I can go to beach. But when I am at the beach and these, again, shifting back into a constituted state of personhood, of beingness happens, then it becomes... Okay, I think my questions has been answered. And it's sufficient, so thank you for that. That's all.
Thank you.
Hello. Yesterday I tried what you said that try
I
to
told you not to try.
Yeah, I mean.
I said you had no job.
Yeah, you have no job.
You have no job. What are we doing?
But it makes me more suffer.
Yeah.
I don't know what is the reason. And today I learned that even if we think that I am thinking itself is coming in a biological thought, and I is not a real I that it's coming in the mind only, then why the one who is witnessing it gets involved in it? That is my root problem.
Because of this belief of personal doership. So the suffering is there, and the belief of personal doership comes up and says, I have to do something about it. I can do something about it. So then it gets involved. How can I get rid of this? This shouldn't be here. So yesterday I think your comment was, so much effort to control the mind.
Mm-hmm.
I spend so much time controlling the mind and I can't do it. And so my suggestion was, the idea that you can control the mind is more of the mind that you're trying to control. And so the suggestion is, you have no job. You have nothing to do.
Still get involved in thoughts.
Sure.
And after some few minutes, I come to know that I was involved in some.
So this saying you've got nothing to
Line
do
of
doesn't
thought.
mean it's suddenly going to be peace. It just means that you might see that there's suffering, and then there's involvement in the suffering, and then you have nothing to do with that involvement. You don't have to do anything about it. And then you might find that more involvement in the suffering happening. And what the automatic response is to keep trying to control it and fix it. That's what all this involvement in the suffering is. And to the extent that a thought keeps coming up, you have nothing to do. That's the job that I was given. I have nothing to do. But you see compulsively it happens. Then what is seeing all of that happen? Usually it's a thought that sees another thought at first. And the thought says, oh, that's suffering. And then another thought says, oh, that's a thought. And another thought, and that's a thought. And so thought starts watching thought. That's not witnessing. That's what we think is witnessing. That's observing, where thought observes another thought. And at some point when we see, each time I see that's a thought. And that's a thought. And that's a thought. And then the mind can actually just stop. It understands. The only solution is to stop. When the mind is very active, there isn't necessarily a solution. Suffering, the first noble truth, life is suffering. It's just a description of life.
Life is suffering.
Life is suffering. So, to see that is, yes, I know. You go, I know that. I put a tick next to the first noble truth. That's progress, actually. To know for yourself, based on your own experience, that life is suffering. It's like in Alcoholics Anonymous, you can't start the program until step one. You stand up there, and some people will be. No, I'm not an alcoholic. I don't have a problem. I've got this under control. And the facilitator says, you haven't started the program yet. You start the program when you go, yeah, my name is whatever, and I'm an alcoholic. Okay, welcome to the program. So life is suffering is sort of welcome to the program. Yeah.
If life is suffering, what to say? It's still that. If this is true, that life is suffering, then why are you here?
Because there's a second noble truth. But if I tell you the second noble truth, you'll want to jump onto the second one before the first one is finished. So the second noble truth is there is a way out of suffering. But first, maybe you need to see life as suffering to a certain depth. So you can't go on to the second one till the first one is completed.
So whatever is going on is absolutely fine. Whatever is going on in day-to-day life, they're getting suffered or getting lost in the thoughts, and getting lost in the thoughts and that to which in guilty thoughts or something like that. It is okay.
It just is. I mean, it's suffering, and suffering is a very valid part of life. In fact, it's a very big part of life, which is why you go to the extent of actually saying life, when I look at it, life is suffering. Meaning when a certain seed is in place, even when there is pleasure present, there is still suffering. Pleasure doesn't mean the end of suffering. Pleasure means I'm there enjoying it, but when is it going to end?
Okay.
That thought is there while we're enjoying pleasure. It's suffering that prevents us from fully enjoying pleasure. So we find that when there's pain, we're suffering about the pain. This shouldn't be there. Why did you do this? I should have prevented this. All of that suffering when there's pain. And even when there's pleasure, we're worried about when it's going to end, how we're going to deal with the next part of life after this pleasure ends. So, yeah, life is suffering. Actually, I should say this more often, because what I normally say is a description about human happiness, right? Human happiness is the end of suffering. It's a description, and people, the doership inside of us goes, life's the end of suffering. I'll have that, thanks. Where do I place my order? How do I make this happen? I'm going to do it. And the emphasis is that, and you missed the first part, I think I emphasized this first part of the thought, is these are all descriptions, they're not instructions for the doer to achieve.
Okay.
So when the statement is that life, happiness for the human being is the end of suffering, it's just a description of something that's available, something that might happen, not something that is necessarily going to happen. Everything that happens in life is destiny. And so therefore, if the doer sets up this idea, oh, I'm going to have the end of suffering. Very quickly, if we're lucky, awareness will land on the fact that this is more suffering, setting up the idea that life should be peace of mind. Whereas in fact, life, for the most part, is suffering. So with that understanding, when suffering arises, we go, here's life. We don't think, oh, the universe is broken, something has gone majorly wrong because suffering is here. That's how we normally relate to suffering, because it's so uncomfortable. Something's definitely gone wrong. I need to fix this. But if we can come to see that suffering is a very valid part of a momentary experience, not my doing, it's there because it's destined to be there. This is the same with tragedy, with pleasure and pain. If we become familiar with the flow of life, the nature of the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. And so if we understand this, when pain comes into our life, we're not surprised. But our normal relationship to pleasure and pain is, as soon as pain comes into our life, once again we think the universe is broken. This shouldn't be like this. So to come to see life on the flow of life level, which is the biological level, and on the attitudinal level for what it is. On the flow of life level, it's always pleasure or pain. On the attitudinal level, if life has put in place certain beliefs, it's going to be suffering. And so when that happens, we put a tick, yep, life working.
If life is suffering and pain is there, or pain is inevitable, then why do we need to take care of it? We need to fix it, right?
Because we don't see it as inevitable. The irony is, the more we see it as inevitable, the more the suffering is going to dissipate. Because the more inevitable we see it as, the more witnessing will happen, the less involvement there will be. Okay. So the more we see it as inevitable, the more the suffering dissolves. The more the suffering dissolves, the more connection there is to self. The more connection to self there is, the less important pleasure or pain is. On a biological level, it's still pleasure or pain, no question, but we don't feel attacked by it. So once again, this process is completely counterintuitive, that not doing anything about the suffering is the way life brings about a diminishing in the suffering. When life makes us do something about the suffering, life is keeping the suffering in place. So to see life as inevitably suffering from when it's there, based on the notion, based on the understanding that suffering is a reaction to certain psychological conditioning that you weren't in control of. You didn't put the psychological conditioning in place, life put it in place, and life is the one that takes it away by including new conditioning, such as being put forward now, that says life is suffering, nothing to do about it. And if that becomes part of your new conditioning, when suffering arises, you might find a thought arising that says, this is suffering, nothing to do about it. That thought is very different to the thought that you've been describing, which is suffering arising, and I have to do something about it. I find myself getting involved in it. Not a criticism of you, right? Not saying you shouldn't get involved, because the involvement is not your doing. The involvement based on your up-to-date conditioning. Life brings in new conditioning. And then we find the reaction inside being different.
So even if I get involved in the mind, maybe in some sort of guilty thoughts or some future planning thoughts or something like that, and I come to know that I lost this present moment, or I lost the connection with the present moment, then do you say that automatically I'll come to know that with this is what the suffering was, so it's okay that it is going to happen?
Yeah, and if the suffering is intense, I think dropping the idea of connection in the present moment is a good thing. Because when suffering is there, connection in the present moment is not available. If we set the connection, this idea of I want to be connected in presence up, which is the opposite of suffering.
Because there is a concept that if you stay in a present moment, that I am this, everything will be taken care of.
Yeah, if you can, but the point is that that's a happening, not your doing. So coming into I amness is something that happens or it doesn't. So see if it happens. If it doesn't happen, surrender to the fact it hasn't happened. To the extent that you see that there is a fighting of the mind to make it happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Recognize that to be more suffering.
Yeah.
Which simply means life is suffering. I'm going to let it be suffering for this time. So, we could go around in circles. The thing is that the answer is not going to be found right now. The answer is, once again, you have another task tonight to do whatever happens according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Which is, you have no job to do really. That means. But what we spoke about today may have become part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Sorry?
What we spoke of just now may well have become part of your up-to-date conditioning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. Okay, we don't know. We'll just see what the reaction is and what the movement is through, and then you don't even know. You just know that the reaction is always based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Okay.
Nothing. Don't worry. Nothing to do.
Not just you, all of us too.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll have last question. I have to learn how to answer questions briefly and succinctly. Maybe this will be my opportunity.
Well, I hope my question is going to be brief also. Lately you were talking about, giving an example, like going to satsang and...
Is the microphone on?
Yeah. Should be, because I hear myself actually, it's so annoying. So you were giving as an example, we'd go satsangs after satsangs, whereas maybe we would have a lighting moment saying, actually I want to go to the beach. But then I thought that sometimes I could have this behavior, and then that thought would come up with, you're escaping.
Mm-hmm.
That's my problem. I don't know when I'm escaping, and I don't know when I'm free. And sometimes I can find freedom in this escaping. So I'm just turning around.
The thought you're escaping could become the obstacle to your freedom. So it may well be a useful thought, I'm escaping, because it may keep you from escaping if that's what's really happening. If it gets turned into a belief that says, I have to stay here because I was told that if I run away I'm escaping, then that too has become a new belief that is keeping you from just being and moving according to your biological conditioning, because it's become a should or a shouldn't based on an attachment to outcomes. You say, I'm going to get this outcome because I'm going to do what I've been told I should do. And then that should and shouldn't is part of the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. But this is life again. It puts these things in place, and the way I suggest that we refine is by keeping this description in mind, that suffering comes when the belief of personal doership is active. And so if suffering is there, then it can be an invitation to see what form of suffering is present. So awareness and the working mind that has its up-to-date conditioning that knows the different forms of suffering may see I'm suffering because I'm set up a should. I should stay here. And that should is going to create a suffering. And for me, I tend to want to drop dynamics that have created suffering, and we can only do this when awareness lands on what dynamic is in play that is creating suffering. So at some point in spiritual teachings, a spiritual teaching says in each moment do exactly what you think or feel you should do. Now, other spiritual teachings will say, people aren't ready to hear that. And it's true. In this teaching, these pointers, it says your list of shoulds and shouldn'ts, even the spiritual ones, ultimately are the obstacle to your freedom. The obstacle to just allowing life to be exactly as it is without having a precondition on what I should and shouldn't do. All our shoulds and shouldn'ts prevent us from actually feeling deep in the body, what do I really feel like doing now? And the reason that some teachings say if you tell people to do that, you're going to have a big problem, because it's true, the belief in personal doership in some people is so strong that it will tell us I feel like doing all sorts of things that are not helpful. And so those people find themselves in a path that tells them what they should and shouldn't do for a while, till that discipline either brings about a weakening in the belief in personal doership, or it creates so much resistance that awareness recognizes I just need to let go of all of these shoulds and shouldn'ts, even the spiritual ones. And so still I would say if you consciously do what you feel like doing, if from time to time feeling from the belief in personal doership comes up and says this is what you really need, and you go, I'm going to do what I feel like doing, and you do it, then if you do it with awareness, like you really are consciously aware of doing what you feel like, even if it's coming from a place of personal doership, the fact that we're really feeling means we'll be aware of the outcome. And when the outcome is an outcome of suffering, or an outcome that we see, this consistently happens when I follow this feeling, then that becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning. That then next time when we go, what do you feel like doing? And that feeling comes up and you go, yeah, but that I know that one not to be coming from a balanced place. I know this one is coming from my attachment to outcomes, my desire, my craving for something that is not what I really need. So then next time it comes up, you go, what do I feel like below this? And we learn, we become reconditioned by that experience of doing what we feel like and seeing the outcome of it, feeling the outcome, especially the outcome that makes us comfortable with what we're doing. Yes, very good. So I think there's 2 more. Today's Sunday, right? Yes. Monday, Tuesday. Last 2 satsangs. Everyone's very welcome. I basically say the same thing in slightly different ways. But that's not a problem, because there's one problem at the root of it. When we look at it from a dynamics point of view, the problem is always the same. So the words that are said are more or less the same, dealing with that same problem. It's a deeply, deeply ingrained problem. And so what it requires is the conditioning to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And there's a lot of concepts. We don't have to understand them all in one sitting. What tends to happen is something that's said resonates. We contemplate it for some time, and then we come back and we listen to something else clicks. Sometimes one thing clicks or stays around for a month, and that's the process working. And then we hear the same talk, but instead of awareness landing on one thing that's said, that it landed on last month, it picks up something else, and they go, oh wow, that fits in. Now that I've seen this makes sense. So, thank you.